Hi everybody, welcome back to Canada's Boxing Channel. I hope you're all doing well out there. Blindingly sunny day today, though it would be a mistake to go out there without being really well wrapped up because it's pretty cold. Anyways, today I thought we would continue our trip down memory lane, a series if you like, where we look at the great mostly heavyweight boxers of the past. So far we've talked about Joe Louis, Rocky Marciano, we've talked about Floyd Patterson, and I thought today we would talk about somebody who fought both Marciano and Joe Louis, none other than the Cincinnati Cobra, Ezzard Charles, a fellow who I think we chronically underrate these days. But as always, we'll ask, do we think he was underrated, overrated, just about right? Does he make my lifetime top 10? Does he make my all-time top 10? And of course, I invite your comments in the comments section below. So, without further ado, let's just take a little career retrospective and have a look at the career and life of Mr. Charles. So, Ezzard Charles, interesting fun fact. He picked up the name Ezzard because apparently his folks couldn't afford to pay the fee that the delivery doctor was charging for bringing Ezzard into the world. But his mom promised the doctor that she would name her son after the doctor. So Dr. Ezzard was the delivery doctor. Consequently, Ezzard Charles is who he is. So he was born in 1921 in Lawrenceville, Georgia, but he grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, because his parents split up when Ezzard was about 9 years old, and so his mom and young Ezzard moved off to Cincinnati. And of course that gave the nickname, the Cincinnati Cobra. A very smart kid apparently, did very well in school, and he loved all sports. And of course, one of the most popular sports in North America when he was growing up was boxing. And he was inspired by the great Jack Johnson and Tiger Flowers. But it was a visit to his neighborhood by Kid Chocolate that made him decide, yeah, I want to be a boxer. And he was really good. Amateur boxer. He had 47 straight wins. He won the Golden Gloves Championships and the National AAU Middleweight Championships in 1939. It was thought that his technical skills, his speed, and his ring IQ were really first class, much better than one would have expected from a kid of his age. And his first trainer, a Welshman, surprisingly, a guy called Bert Williams, a First World War vet, thought that no kid should be hitting as quickly and with such precision as young Ezzard, and took him under his wing and had high hopes for him. So he makes his professional debut in 1940. He's only 18 years old, and he quickly gained a reputation as a skilled fighter, a strategic fighter, a kid who knew his way around the ring, as they say. He did very well. He had, in fact, in 1942, he beat Joey Maxim twice. And Joey Maxim, of course, was a very well regarded light heavyweight, and in fact, at one time, a light heavyweight champion. He was called up for the military in 1944. So the draft spoiled his early career. He only fought a couple of times in 44, didn't fight at all in 45. In the military, he served not in one of the specialist units that went around doing morale-boosting fights for the troops, but he actually went off and served in the European Theatre of Operations as a truck driver in Italy. At that time, people may or may not know, African Americans were not permitted combat roles. There was a segregated US military until after the end of World War II. So, nevertheless, Ezzard Charles served his country honorably in, no doubt, a dangerous part of the world. He returns from the military to the United States in 1946. And he resumes his career. He establishes himself as a dominant force in the light heavyweight division. But despite defeating top contenders, like, for example, Archie Moore, who he beat in 1946, 47, and 48, 2 by way of knockout. He also beat Jimmy Bivens and Lloyd Marshall. Again, very well-known contenders, quite famous fighters in their era. He never was allowed to get a shot at the light heavyweight title. Now, there's a couple of things we've spoken about before. There was undoubtedly racial prejudice against black fighters, and there was also really ugly politics. Now, cynics amongst us could argue that politics has always been involved in boxing from its early days through to today. But nevertheless, a combination of the politics of boxing and, in my view, a prejudice against African American fighters prevented him from getting a well-deserved shot at the light heavyweight title. But Ezzard wasn't going to be deterred. Okay, you're not going to let me compete for the light heavyweight title, I'll move up a weight. And so he ends up becoming a heavyweight. Now, this is a fellow who, of course, started his career as a middleweight. He moves up to heavyweight. In 1948, he was involved in a really tragic incident. There was a fellow he was fighting called Sam Baroudi, who unfortunately was killed as a result of his fight with Ezzard Charles. And it's thought that Ezzard Charles was traumatized by that, and no doubt it stayed with him for the remainder of his life. Not unlike, of course, Sugar Ray Robinson, who killed a fellow in the ring, Jimmy Doyle. And it's, again, these kind of things, undoubtedly are harrowing experiences. So in 1949, eventually, Ezzard Charles gets an opportunity, because the great Joe Louis, who had had 25 title defenses and was the longest reigning heavyweight champion ever, had retired. Now, we know, of course, that Joe Louis made a comeback, but in 1949, Joe Louis, the title was vacant, and there was a world championship, if you like, playoff. Well, the 2 finalists in this playoff were Ezzard Charles and Jersey Joe Walcott. So they're fighting for the World Heavyweight Championship on June the 22nd, 1949 in Chicago, in the Windy City. So Charles outboxed Walcott, went the full 15-round distance, and he won by unanimous decision. Now, newspaper reports at the time said that the fight wasn't particularly exciting, but it was Charles's superior technical skills and movement that helped him secure the victory against the bigger man. In fact, Jersey Joe and Charles had a series of fights. In March the 7th, 1951, Charles again beat Jersey Joe by unanimous decision. In July the 18th of 1951, now look how quickly these fellows are fighting. So you have a world title defense in March. You have another world title defense, the rematch, in July. I mean, today we think of a boxer who fights 2 or 3 times a year as being very, very active. Not so in these days. But in their July 1951 fight, Jersey Joe Walcott knocked out Charles in the 7th round and took the title. Now, Jersey Joe Walcott was the perennial contender, right? We will remember that he was the guy who refused to say no. And this was a big upset. Walcott landed a perfect left hook, and Charles was laid out, and Walcott becomes the champion. But if we back up the bus a little bit, we must remember that Ezzard Charles defended his title in 1950, the year before, against the returning Joe Louis. We've talked about before how Joe Louis found himself absolutely impecunious because the United States Internal Revenue Service, went after him for money that he had allegedly earned while he was in the military himself, doing exhibition fights, and he was signed over the back of the check to the Army or Navy relief funds. But because the money had been paid to him. The Inland Revenue Service went after him. It's a travesty, and really a shocking way for the American government to treat anybody. To treat Joe Louis that way, it's actually a head spinner. But regardless, Joe Louis felt that he had to come back. And in 1950, September the 27th, 1950, he challenged Ezzard Charles to try and regain the championship. Charles dominated most of the fight to outpoint Joe Louis, who was showing signs of age and was clearly not in his absolute prime. Had he been in his absolute prime, he wouldn't have retired in the first place, right? So, Ezzard Charles wins a unanimous decision. Getting back to the Jersey Joe Walcott matches, they had their final fight on June the 5th, 1952. And this was a close fight. It was somewhat controversial at the time. He scored a decision to retain his title over Ezzard Charles. And many people think that Ezzard Charles actually did enough to beat Jersey Joe, but such was the result. He wasn't able to regain his title. Again, Ezzard Charles continues boxing, of course, and he has two really epic fights with Rocky Marciano. Rocky Marciano, as we know, he beat Jersey Joe Walcott by introducing Jersey Joe Walcott to the Susie Q, and Rocky Marciano was the world heavyweight champion. But in June the 17th, 1954, Ezzard Charles, the former champion, takes on Rocky Marciano. He was the underdog at the time, but he became the only person to take Rocky Marciano the full 15 rounds. He was one hell of an achievement. He was the smaller man, and he was the underdog, and Rocky was at his prime. But he nevertheless lost a 15-round decision to Rocky Marciano. No small feat indeed. Many very, very good fighters didn't get to see the final bell against The Rock. He has a second fight with Rocky on September the 17th of 1954. So again, not much time. So June, July, August, September. 3 months later, he's back in the ring with Rocky Marciano. I mean, we think now if you have a rematch, it's maybe a year and a half even. But no, 3 months, back in the ring. In the rematch, Charles gave Marciano quite a cut, but was knocked out in the 8th round. And let me just refer to my notes here. So he continued to fight, but he was no longer really at his peak. And if you look at BoxRec, you will see most of Ezzard Charles's, I think it's 15 of Ezzard Charles's defeats come, in the Rocky and post-Rocky Marciano era. His BoxRec actually shows 95 wins, 25 losses, and 1 draw. But like I say, 15 of those came after his fights with Rocky Marciano. So he was definitely carried on, and as he was declining in his abilities, as his speed left him, then he was accruing more losses. This isn't really surprising. This is the trajectory of many fighters. After retiring in 1959, he struggled. He struggled financially. He worked as a referee. He made various appearances. But then by the time this 1960s rolled around, his health was failing. And he was actually diagnosed with what we now know as ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease. And he ended up being in a wheelchair, which is a really tragic, sad end for such an elite premier athlete. He passed away on May the 28th, 1975, at the very young age of 53. And he was posthumously honored for his contributions. Cincinnati has a street named Ezzard Charles Drive, and he's been inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame. Where do I think Ezzard Charles fits? I think he's mostly been forgotten about by modern fans. While it is occasionally you will hear a YouTuber or somebody talking about old fighters, although I'm sad to say most YouTubers seem to have a memory that doesn't go back much past Mike Tyson, to be perfectly honest. But when they do acknowledge older fighters, they will talk about Muhammad Ali, they'll talk maybe about early George Foreman. They don't usually go back much further. Those that do sometimes, quite often, skip over Ezzard Charles. It's often sort of Joe Louis, Rocky Marciano, then we see Floyd Patterson, maybe, then we see Sonny Liston, then we see Ali, and we forget that there were people like Ezzard Charles, great champions, supreme athletes who gave everything there was to give and more, and who won against the odds in many cases. The same can be said of Jersey Joe Walcott. Maybe, if you like, we can spend some time talking about him in a future video. But where do I think of Ezzard Charles? Well, since he retired in 1959, he doesn't make my lifetime top 10 because he wasn't active during my lifetime. So I don't have to worry myself about where he fits in my lifetime top 10 because I'm a 1960 vintage. I don't have him either in my all-time top 10 as much as, you know, one could make a case for him being, somebody who achieved remarkable results. There's only 10 spots at that top table. And so Ezzard Charles doesn't make the cut there. Does he make the cut for the top 15? I don't think so. But I'm much more comfortable if we start talking about top 20 or top 25. But nevertheless, I do think he's underrated because we simply forget about him. We forget about his achievements. And we forget about the fact that he beat Joe Louis, he beat Jersey Joe Walcott, he went the full distance with Rocky Marciano, he beat Joey Maxim, he beat Jimmy Bivens, he beat a lot of names. So, let me know what you think. Do you think that Ezzard Charles is underrated? Do you think that he's overrated? I would be surprised if anyone thinks he's overrated. Have you found this video interesting? And would you like to see more? If you'd like to see more of these historical retrospectives, put a note in the comment section and make a suggestion. I enjoy talking about fighters from yesteryear. I've almost unlimited respect for those fellows. And I also encourage you to go and read books about these great fighters. YouTube is full of some really good documentaries as well. I've mentioned some channels in the past. John Vincent channel, for example, quickly comes to mind. There's a lot of good footage, and if, like me, you love the history of boxing, set aside a couple of hours on an afternoon when you can just sort of take a trip down memory lane and look how these fighters were. So, please subscribe so you can get updates regularly whenever I release something new. I release something pretty much most days. Share the videos amongst your friends and other boxing fans. But most importantly, have a fabulous day wherever you are. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Cheers.